All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody, and you're very welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this morning to the Policy and Practice webinar titled The Postcode Lottery of Welfare Reform, Are You Hit the Hardest? We're delighted to have so many of you here today, so thank you very much for joining us. Okay, so on our agenda today, I just want to take you through a little bit about policy and practice in case, before I do that, let me just do a little bit of housekeeping for those who perhaps are new to webinar formats. While I'm chatting, if you could look at the panel to the right hand of your screen and just digitally raise your hand so that I know that you can hear what I'm saying, I'd be very grateful. And just while you're doing that, thank you everybody, I'd just like to reiterate to please do ask questions in the panel on the right hand side. There's a little box there for asking questions. We have a poll and a survey that will be served automatically at the end of the webinar, but please do interact and post questions. We will have time for questions at the end, but if they don't get answered, then certainly I will follow up afterwards. And we do aim to have you on your way by 11:30 this morning. We have a lot to get through, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. My name is Janet Harkin. I work in policy and practice in the marketing team. But today we're going to be joined by Devin, who is the CEO and founder of Policy and Practice, and my colleague Joelle Reland, who is a policy and operations researcher for Policy and Practice. And Joelle has done much of the analysis that we're going to talk through today. And it's great to have his contribution to Policy and Practice. We really do value it. Okay, so on that note then, in terms of the agenda, what we're going to cover today, a little bit about policy and practice, just a very brief overview of what we do. Joelle's then going to take you through an overview of the approach to the analysis so that you can appreciate how we've arrived at some of our conclusions. We're going to look at the findings of our benchmarking analysis and also reiterate throughout, whilst it's important to have the benchmark, it's also important to understand the household level view as well. And we're going to take you through a little bit of that as well. Devin is also going to talk about the future and understanding the changing shape of income, employment and poverty, and also how policy and practice can help, what we've done for local authorities so far, and also what we could do in the future as well. But before we get to that, just a little bit about policy and practice. If you're new to us and we're new to you, what we do is we make the welfare system simple to understand so that people can make the decisions that are right for them. And the thing about making the welfare system simple to understand is what drives us. That's what gets us up in the morning. Policy and practice we're a social policy software and consulting business. And as I said, we were founded by Devon, who was part of the team that developed universal credit at the Centre for Social Justice. And when that policy was adopted by government a few years ago, he left there to set up policy and practice because he was keen to ensure that the policy intent of universal credit in particular was actually put into practice on the front line. Since that time, and together with the team that has built policy and practice, Devon's facilitated conversations between leading local authorities and the Prime Minister's office to ensure that the frontline feedback about welfare reform policy, how it's implemented, is being heard at central government level. In addition, Devon and the team has helped local organisations to understand the aggregate and the cumulative impact of welfare reform changes on their customers so that they can accurately target support programmes. And finally then, to close the loop, the software that Policy and Practice has developed simplifies the conversations that frontline advisors can have with customers because it clearly shows what benefits those customers could get under the current system and under the move to universal credit and compares the two side by side using data visualization and colour, etc. So that's a little bit about policy and practice. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to my colleague Joelle, and he's going to introduce you to the topic of the webinar today. Over to you, Joelle.
Okay, good morning everyone. I'm Joel, and I'm going to run you through the first part of explaining what exactly our benchmarking analysis is. And in order to do that, it's first of all important to explain what we at Policy and Practice do, because that's the approach which has then been moved into the benchmarking data that we've put together. So if you were to give your data to Policy and Practice, your CTRS or SHIBI data, which has the information on low-income households in a particular housing association or local authority who are in receipt of certain benefits. We then take that data, we clean it up, and we run it through software that we have in-house here in order to model the impact that welfare reform is likely to have on these people. So this means that we can look at the impact of different reforms, such as the benefit cap, universal credit itself, or the LHA cap, the under occupation charge, various different reforms, and we can look at how many people are going to be impacted, the amount they're going to be impacted by, and how this will change over time between 2016 and 2020 to give individual breakdowns and a cumulative impact assessment. And as you can see on the map further down the screen, we can also look at a breakdown across the ward, a heat map which tells you exactly which households are going to be hit hardest, so that you can not only understand the broad trends, but really pinpoint those that you need to get to in order to make those strategic decisions which help people not be too adversely affected by the sudden changes which welfare reform will have. And so that is kind of the overall approach. And that's what we move on to. And before I go on to explain, I'm going to let Devin talk a bit about permission, because obviously we're using some quite important and potentially confidential data here.
Great. Thank you very much, Joel. I wanted to come in here and just kind of make this point about permissions. The slide itself isn't very clear, but I just wanted to sort of ensure everyone listening on the call that when we work with local authorities, we sign a secure data sharing agreement. We ensure that the information we take hold of has all personally identifiable information redacted. And when we are using local authority data for this type of analysis, which we believe will hopefully have a broader impact, by sharing some of this benchmarking information across local authorities, we always ask permission first. So we spoke to each one of the local authorities in advance and ensure that they were happy for us to use their data in this way. We take no personally identifiable information, but we do keep hold of a unique record which allows the local authorities that we're working with to map that back and understand exactly which households are impacted and how. Thank you very much, Joel. I thought that was really important. I wanted to get that out at the outset. Back to you.
Cool. Okay, thanks, Devin. And now we can look at exactly what we do with these individual SHIBI CTRS data sets when we compile them. And so basically, when I came into the company recently, one kind of a key brief for me was to kind of think about how we can do more with the data that we already have. And this has meant compiling it into a collection where all the data is in one place. And so as you can see, we've got nearly 500,000 low-income households which are part of that cohort. So we're getting a pretty good picture of what's going on across the country. This doesn't mean just one standard picture, but actually breaking it down. And there are two kind of key ways in which this data has been broken down in our benchmarking analysis. The first thing is breaking down the types of reform. That's, as I was talking about earlier, looking at how different reforms impact differently, because it's not a consistent trend across each one. If you're particularly impacted by the lower benefit cap in a local authority or a housing association, you may not be impacted by the under occupation charge so significantly. And the second really key point is to look at the demographic breakdown of the types of areas that are being affected by welfare reform. And this doesn't just mean the northwest versus the southeast, but this means the type of city or town that we're looking at, because that we found is the key indicator. So we have three kind of key groups: London boroughs, big cities, and small cities and towns. And if we go on to the next slide, we'll show you kind of what some of those key differences are between them and why it matters to look at welfare reform in this way. So as you can see, London boroughs tend to have more people of working age than big cities and small cities and towns, and that's going to have a big impact on how certain reforms affect, because they affect primarily people that are in work and of working age. And as you can see there, London boroughs also have a higher level of people in work than other local authorities. And each one has its kind of particularities which give it, which mean that they're affected in different ways. That also comes down to the level of social housing versus private accommodation. That also has an impact on certain reforms. And so essentially kind of there are quite stark differences between these three types of council which have consequences for welfare reform. And so we asked, why does this matter? What are we going to get from looking at them in different ways? And I think kind of as a local authority, the question that we get asked most by these people is, how are we doing against other people? That's what they want to know. Against people of similar profiles to them, they want to know if they're ahead of the curve or what they can do to catch up, or where their strengths and weaknesses are. And that's what we're providing through this. Because on the one hand, we do provide a kind of broad national benchmark, a regional breakdown, which tells you how you're likely to be impacted through these trends. We can say that if you're a small city, it's likely that you'll be particularly affected by this reform because other small cities tend to be as well. If you have a certain level of social housing, maybe this will affect you better or worse than in other parts of the country. So that's kind of the one level that we can have. We can give you a preemptive analysis, tell you what is likely to be the case, but we take that one step further, which is to use these benchmarks, these kind of general trends, to place you very specifically within them. Because if we can say that 40% of households in the standard London borough are affected by the LHA cap, off the top of my head, I don't really know if that is the correct figure, but it's hypothetical. Then we can say if you are another London borough and you're at 28%, then you're doing fantastically well. If you're at 55%, you're not doing so well, and you're going to have to find a solution to that. So by moving bottom up to look at a very broad trend, we can then place you and tell you where your strengths and weaknesses lie in comparison to other people of your type. And that's kind of the real virtue of the analysis through benchmarking. And I think now we're going to go over to Devin, who's going to take you into a bit more of the detail of this analysis and what we can pull out.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Joel. And thank you as well so much for pulling together all of this analysis, which, again, given that you've only been with us a short time, is quite an achievement. And I just want to say well done and thank you. Before I kick off and start talking about some of the findings. So before I get into the detail of how these different regions are affected, I think it's important just to ask and point out that every household matters. We're about to, I think, kick off a poll, aren't we, Janet, about just asking whether you're in a small town, whether who we have on this webinar is a London borough, a large city, or a small city or town.
Yep.
And what that helps you to do is to understand where you are relative to other areas. But there are some challenges with understanding that aggregate analysis. So it's very helpful to understand how your local area is affected relative to other local areas. And we can use that to sort of understand what the core drivers of whether or not how households are impacted are. So we can use this to understand the drivers, and that's very helpful. But it's important to remember that these average or aggregate scores can mask extremes within boroughs or even within wards. And we're able to do this. The way we're able to do this is to take household level data and we aggregate that up. And it's really important just to understand the importance of that household level data and what that helps you to do, as well as understanding how your local authority is affected. It's important as well to understand how individual households within your local authority are affected, because that's what allows you to target the right sort of support to the right people. Janet, do we have a poll?
Yeah, sure. I can launch that now. Okay. You should see that on your screen, Devon.
Yep. So yeah, if you want to select, it'd be really helpful, I think, for everyone to understand, and I can then tailor some of the analysis for for example, if we have more people from London boroughs on this call, I'll speak a bit more about what the implications might be for them. Whereas if we have more small cities and towns, let us know which of these categories you feel that you are within just by selecting, and I think you have 30 seconds to complete it, so perhaps 10 seconds left or so.
Sure. Okay, I think we have, most people have voted now, Devon, so that's okay.
Brilliant.
Over 80% have voted, so let's not keep everybody in suspense. So if I close and then share, you should be able to see the results.
Okay. That's helpful. A decent mix, but the vast majority would consider themselves to be in small cities or towns. So I'll try and talk a little bit more about what the implications or impacts might be in a small city or town. Okay. That's great, and thank you very much for that. So to kick off, I mean, the presentation, we didn't know what the balance would be, so we focused it on all three, but it does help you, as I said, to understand what the drivers of differences are. So here across London, you've got across London, big cities, small cities and towns, the type of tenure, so the proportion of people within these general areas that are social tenants, that are private tenants, and that are owner-occupiers. And it might be helpful for you to understand where you are in and amongst your peers, and generally where you might be. If you're in a small city or town, this is more likely to be the shape. So you're going to have probably a higher proportion of social tenants than large cities or towns. This isn't across your whole population. It's really important to understand that this is across the low-income households that are currently in receipt of housing benefit or council tax support, which are overwhelmingly those households that will be affected by welfare reform. So of low-income households, small cities and towns will have a greater proportion that are social. If you look at the whole population, you might find that actually, this mix looks quite different, but this is in terms of the low-income households in your area. And the reason that's important is if you've got more social tenants, that's a driver. For example, it's interesting perhaps to think that actually the bedroom tax might have a disproportionate effect because you've got more people in social housing in your area. Whereas again, here in London, you've got more people in the private rented sector where the LHA cap and the benefit cap, as we'll see, have a bigger or a different kind of an impact. Okay, the second of these charts, and thanks Janet as well for putting these graphics together, I think it makes things much clearer, is to look at the impact, generally the impact of universal credit. So I think this is the impact of universal credit if it were rolled out today. If everyone were on universal credit today, and transitional protection wasn't taken into account, so this proportion of people that are worse off, you could argue that, I'm sure the DWP would argue that they'll be in receipt of transitional protection initially, so they'll be no worse off in cash terms. But I think as that transitional protection works out, runs out, this will be the impact. You see, what's interesting here is that London has a high proportion of people generally who are worse off and better off. And that's fundamentally because of the driver that Joel mentioned in his earlier slide, which is that it has a higher proportion of working age households that are in work. So if you are in work, the impact of universal credit is going to be is going to impact you more, either making you better off or making you worse off. So it's really demography that's the driver here. Whereas in small cities or towns, you can see that there's a greater proportion. Well, actually, in big cities, there's a greater proportion of households that have no impact, and they also have the lowest proportion of households that are in work amongst their working age population. And small cities and towns, there's a bit of a mix, but you can see that the big note and big point here, perhaps for most of you on this webinar, is that there's a disproportionate number of people that are worse off in small cities and towns relative to those that are better off. And I think that's important to bear in mind. So there will be more households that need transitional protection. And the reason knowing who these households are, the reason that might be important might be to say you can easily see how the communication or the level of support offered to someone that is likely to be worse off or need transitional protection under universal credit would be very different to the type of support that might be on offer if they were likely to be better off under universal credit. So these households are likely to benefit more from employment support if they understood the impact that universal credit was going to have. So we're going to go on to look at two different reforms in a second, specifically at universal credit and the benefit cap in a little bit more detail in a second. But I thought before that it'd be useful to get the audience participation going and ask you a couple of questions. So we've just done this national benchmarking analysis. It's great to have this level of interest. So we had a huge number of people register for this webinar, and we've got a very high number of attendees today. What we'd really like to understand is what's most interesting about this for you. So by combining national benchmarks and understanding and breaking that down into sort of these groups, London boroughs, large cities, small cities and towns, and looking at household level data, we can tell you where you stand against your peers in terms of the impacts of welfare reform. And over time, we hope to also answer the question about what are different local authorities that are perhaps less affected or more affected, what are they doing differently? Is it just demography or characteristics, or are there policy drivers that are having an impact here? And the more data we're able to collect and the more local authorities that we're working with, the easier it will be for us to answer that question. So let me ask you guys a question here, and if you just want to sort of post it either in the chat box or as a question, if you can let us know, what would you most like to learn if you had access to the benchmarking analysis? And Joel will give you an example of that shortly. What is the thing you would most like to, 1, 2 or 3 things you would most like to learn? What are your biggest questions? And then also, just to kind of really hammer home the point is, it isn't necessarily just about how your local area is impacted. I think that is useful for perhaps making the case for additional support from DWP. But in terms of getting support to people, would it be helpful to you to understand the impact on individual households within your local area? if you can understand who was positively affected by universal credit versus negatively affected, as I mentioned earlier, would that be important to you? And again, just do give that a moment's thought, post a question or post a comment, and I just want to sort of make sure you're thinking about that. Are we getting one or two responses in, Janet?
Not specifically on that. There was a point, I suppose, a point of reference made from somebody who says that there are housing associations outside of London who have a mixed demographic of small and big cities. So the point about housing associations going across sort of council types or cohort types.
Absolutely, and how might this kind of analysis be useful to you? So if you look at the aggregate figures, if you've got, it's a very simple way of saying across our housing association, for those managers that are operating within London boroughs, these are the general kinds of trends you can see. For those that are operating within large cities elsewhere, these are the general trends you might see. And for those operating in small cities or towns, these are the general trends you might see. And if you're trying to get communication down to kind of from that level down, breaking it down to that level might be enough for you. Clearly, what's important to us is that you then break it down one level further and understand the impact on individual households, so you can get that right support to the right person. But perhaps a strength housing associations have is that often they tend to know their tenants reasonably well. I think that's helpful, but what the data can sometimes tell you, as I'll show you, is perhaps not just how people are affected today or their current situation, but how they might be affected in the future. That's what we go on to look at here.
Sorry,
go on, Janet.
Devin, while you've been chatting, a few people have come back, and quite a few people have said it would be very useful and positive, very useful to understand the positive and negative impact on individual household levels. One person asks about the sub-local authority level data, e.g., now forgive me for my lack of knowledge of these acronyms, particular MSOA, ward level, LSOA levels. So
yep. I'll come on to that. I actually think we go one level beyond LSOA and MSOA. Because we work with household level data, you can look at individual households and build them up to LSOA, which is local super output area, so your neighborhood, effectively, and build then the LSOA picture up to MSOA, which I forget what the M in the acronym stands for off the top of my head, but a larger neighborhood or a larger area, perhaps a ward type shape. So it's from that household level that you build up to all of these other levels. Whereas actually, generally, when you look at this analysis, they do it top down. So you start off with what is the impact in the northwest of England or wherever, and it's very difficult from that aggregate picture using sample data to then understand how individual households are affected, which is why I think that the power of this type of analysis is so important. Any other questions halfway through?
Just a similar point, really, from another attendee about building up to district levels, because different areas of housing stock would be affected differently. So I think you've answered the point about building up from household level rather than going down from national level.
And I'll talk a bit about that later as well, in a bit more detail once you actually see the data. But I thought it'd be more interesting to kick off with the findings before going down to the next level of detail. So some high-level findings. Again, thank you, Joel, for crunching these numbers. So the impact of universal credit across these three areas, London boroughs, big cities, small cities and towns, is to understand, so this shows the proportion of low-income households who are likely to be worse off or will need transitional protection. And what we're trying to emphasize here is the range. So within London boroughs, I forget off the top of my head exactly what the average was. I'll just flick back and remind myself. 40% worse off on average. But the range is within the handful of London boroughs that we've done this analysis for, ranges from 36 to 47%, which equates to 3,908 households. That, again, using this aggregate level figure, those are perhaps up to 4,000 households that you're missing out on. You're not capturing within your data within your area. If you look at small cities and towns, similarly, there's a wider range here. There's a range of 14%, but because of their lower population, that's a lower number of households, but a greater proportion of households, or certainly a greater proportion of low-income households within those small cities and towns. So that range is understanding the detail is important, is I guess the core point I want to make there. And then to look at the benefit cap, I thought it'd be helpful to look at the change in the number of households impacted. Joel and I were discussing this yesterday, and Joel was reminding me that an explicit reason why the cap is now different, so it started out at 26,000 currently, and it's going to move to 23,000 in London and 20,000 elsewhere, was to more broadly distribute the impact of the benefit cap, or the benefits of the benefit cap, as the DWP would see it, because they see it as a tool to encourage and support people who are able to work into work, and they would argue that it's been successful in doing that. So they specifically wanted it to not just have an impact in London and have an impact elsewhere. And you can see that it started to do that. So if you look at these figures here, 3 times as many households are affected in London, 6 times as many households are affected in large cities, and 10 times as many households are affected in small cities and towns. Now, these multiples, you have to remember, start from a different base. So there's a very low base in small cities and towns. And actually, another thing this emphasizes here is the fact that this is not a wholly representative sample. So we haven't got the data for all big cities here. We haven't got the data for all small cities and towns. It's a sample of, perhaps half a dozen or so. Differing numbers for each of these. It's a sample of about 500,000 households, as Joel mentioned earlier. And which means that the impact, again, within your local authority might be different. And the more local authorities that do this work with us, the more accurate our benchmarking, or our ability to provide this benchmarking service, becomes. So that has a sort of knock-on positive impact on all of you. But so more households are impacted within big cities and small cities and towns. But what is the scale of that impact? We can see here that of those households impacted, the average impact remains highest in London. So it's highest before, significantly, it remains highest. But the gap in that difference has fallen. So the scale of the average impact is greater in big cities and small towns than it was before, but it's increased the most in London. If you factor into the fact that there's a greater impact per household affected, and that there are more households affected, that is important. I think that's a pretty critical piece of information to consider. So it will have a significant impact. Now, I want to pause there again and do think about some of the questions you have about the benchmarking service. I'm going to go into the next level of detail and show you how that benchmarking service was built up. So I'm going to jump out of PowerPoint now. Janet, Joel?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can see the data set. Brilliant.
Yes.
So I'm going to zoom a little bit. Your housing benefit data with personally identifiable information redacted. We run it through our policy modeling engine, which models the impact of each individual reform, and then we then map that back. This is a sample data set that's taken from a real client who we've anonymized here. So what you'd have is a reference number that would allow you to map that back onto the individual household. Typically, we have the postcode data in order for us to be able to do the mapping and understand the geographic impact across the local authority, the ward, etc. And then we can tell you some core or isolate households by demographic impact. So we could just look at households with children, for example, and I'll just select 0. So now, whereas before we weren't. So you can see here that within this data set, 36,327 children and 19,260 households with children. And I've just done that. I'm doing this live, so this is how you'd be able to work with the data from the analysis. The headings. So the benefit cap today. So if we look at the households that are impacted by the benefit cap at 26,000, I'll just select yes. Yeah. And you can see here that there are, sorry, my computer's being a little slow. There are 237 households affected today. Now I can look here at the benefit cap in the future. So we've modeled the impact of the benefit cap in the future alongside a whole range of other reforms. So this is important. So we don't just look at the impact of each one of these reforms in isolation. We take into account the effect that the LHA cap has on whether or not you're affected by the benefit cap, for example, or similarly under occupation. And all of these reforms can have knock-on consequences. So if I say it was 237 households affected by the benefit cap at 26,000, if I just filter the yeses here, I can tell you. I've done it the wrong way around because there'll be more households affected in the future. Within this particular local area, that 237 households has increased to 776 households that will be impacted in the future. You can start to understand a little bit more detail behind whether or not you're a young person that's 18 to 21 and therefore your housing benefit may be at risk, or you might be expected to earn or learn. There's some information here about whether or not the LHA is lower than the social rent in your area. So you can see living wage increase. And that's really important. So I remember from looking at 2 different London boroughs, there's a really powerful driver on the difference in how they're impacted by universal credit. One had many more households that were better off than the other. And that was driven fundamentally by those households that were in work that were then going to benefit. So they had quite a high impact if you looked at universal credit today. But when you looked at the impact of universal credit in 2020, negatively impacted, and that's because they had many houses in their area that were on income that were in work but were on very low earnings. So that helps to sort of drive the policy decision and discussion that the authority might then look into. There's a very brief introduction to the data set. Again, understanding the cumulative impact of all of those reforms combined is important, and hopefully you're able to see that you can actually drill down to that individual household. If I have a bit more time, I'll look into that a little bit more. But again, if you want to post your questions about what you're wondering that data set might show you, do please say. Do ask the question, and then we'll come back to that. And again, what can we do with that data? So who's affected? So we can build this up. You know, one day we'll be building this up to a national picture, and we can kind of start to do that. We've started to do that for, as you've seen, London boroughs, large cities, small cities and towns. But also within your local area, you can start to understand the impact on ward, on neighbourhoods and individual households. And one thing I'd like to do in the future is to look at the impact of, let's say, the 10 most affected postcodes across 10 different small cities and towns, and see if we can understand what the impact is at that really hyper-local level. So what is happening within those 10 postcodes? First of all, where are they? And what's happening within those 10 postcodes? And what can be done about that? So what interventions have been tried for those households in that area, and which of those 10 local authorities have been most successful in that? And what are the drivers behind that? Is it the intervention? Is it the demography? Is it economic growth? What is driving that? And that's how I think fundamentally that's what delivers better policy and better outcomes for people. And that's what we hope to share with you one day in a future webinar. Before I move on to questions, I think there was, we sort of paused for a second for questions. I wanted to sort of hand back over to Joel now. Are there any questions right now, Janet, given that we've paused?
Yeah, sure. There was one that possibly I think you're going to come on to soon, Devon, which was about layering other data sets. So I know that I think you're going to talk about that too, and there's some quite detailed, complicated questions which we may or may not answer now, but yeah, there is some particular interest. So I think let's move to Joel's demo, and then we can work on from that, because I know some of these points are going to be covered by what you're going to be saying in a moment, Devin.
Okay, brilliant, Joel. I'll hand back to you in terms of speaking, but I'll hang on to the controls here, so you'll have to tell me where to go in your within the spreadsheet that you put together that shows the benchmarking. Over to you.
Okay, great. So yeah, you're going to have to scroll up a bit. Kind of all the way to the top of the Excel page. Okay, and so this is basically what your data will look like once we've kind of finished putting it through our software. So Devin showed you before kind of all this kind of hard data that we had, lots of kind of complex numbers and columns, and this is when it's been cleaned up and kind of made to look pretty and more presentable, so that we can actually do some serious analysis with you in order to find out who these households are, as Devon was just talking about previously, and picking out the areas to focus on. So we're going to go across a very brief part of what we can do. This is fairly simple. We're only showing you a small part in order to just give you a taster of how we could go through this, because if we looked at it all, we'd be here all day, and I'm mindful you have to get off fairly soon. So looking at this sample, kind of you can see the basic figures here, working age, percentage of people in work, etc., etc. And then these are just kind of basic stuff, and then we move across to slightly more important figures, and you can see they're highlighted in red if they are here above the average. So if you have, it varies kind of above the average for liable to pay council tax, but otherwise below the average if you're kind of below the standard level. So private tenants, you can see in this, this is one of our samples, but they've been anonymized, so you can see where they stand against the regional standards. They have fewer private tenants than on average, fewer owner-occupiers, fewer council tenants, but social tenants-wise, they have a higher level than most other local authorities in similar demographic types to them. And so this is going to have consequences for reforms, and we can move across. We're going to use housing as a quick example to look at the impact on the LHA cap and on the bedroom tax. And again, we've got some things which are flagged here. They automatically flag if the figures are particularly high. So you can see there we have the number affected by the LHA cap is slightly above the average for the area, as is the number affected by the bedroom tax. We saw before that that's often the case with the bedroom tax, is if you have a high level of social tenants. If there's a high level of demand for social housing, it tends to be that it's more poorly allocated, or it can't be allocated as well as suitably for the people that need specifically one bedroom. So often more people end up having to pay the spare room subsidy, as it is also called. And so there's often a correlation between high social housing, high bedroom tax. And so these are kind of very quick figures which will be flagged up just through looking at this. So when we've cleaned up your data, that will automatically come up for us. We can show it to you, and we get a really nice snapshot quickly of where the kind of red zones are, the areas to focus on, and there'd be obviously many more reforms beyond this that we'd also be looking at. And from there, we could then go back into that hard data, that data that Devon was showing you previously, and find out who these people are. We can find out where they live, who these extra 4 or 5% of people are that are being affected by the bedroom tax and really should be considering the standards. And we'll be able to pick them out. I'm not going to go through the whole way in which we do that now, but we can find them. We can find how many children they have, where they live in the borough, many things like that. And so we can build a really complex picture, a really kind of sharp picture of what's going on in your local authority. And from there, we start to build the solutions around how we're going to deal with that. And so, yeah, I think that's just kind of quick view of kind of what your data will ultimately be turned into with us. And I'll hand back to Devin. Are you there, Devin?
I'm really sorry, I was on mute. I was just going to say, very briefly, I just wanted to point out that the analysis and what this benchmarking piece of work has allowed us to do is to help identify what the hotspots are, so where you might want to focus, and what the actual household level data that builds up allows you to do is then use the filters to identify those individual households that might be affected. And then you can track that back to identify who that household is and perhaps what support they're currently receiving and what might work for them in the future. And also, importantly, track whether or not that might work in the future. So that's probably the next point I want to make, is that we're fundamentally just scratching the surface of what we think is possible here. Local authorities have had, I think we're in a really exciting place with data, with technology, with, I guess, a recognition of the importance of both of those two things in delivering more with less. And a great way to do that is to better target those households. What's also important is to understand how effective interventions might be. So we can start to understand that by looking at tracking the impact or what changes within these households over time. And again, the more local authorities we work with, the more data we have to start to understand that. And the more we feel it's really important to share that with you on these webinars. So when we do identify something that is working, that is effective, I'll mention here actually there's an ebook that Janet's been working on the impact of the benefit cap and what some of our local authority clients have done that has been effective in supporting those households. So if you'd like that, please do message Janet now and she'll make a note and send that out to you, perhaps in the follow-up.
Yep.
But we're generally just scratching the surface here. Back to you, Janet, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say, yes, definitely. I can send that on in the follow-up afterwards for anybody who wants it.
Just understanding what works is critical. There was a question about combining with other data sets, and I didn't spend too much time on it. Perhaps I can just flick across. But we've combined these data sets with, I'm not sure whether we have it in this particular one, but we certainly have in the past combined these data sets with arrears, so housing benefit and council tax arrears data. We've combined it with support payments, so to understand the impact of which households are in receipt of discretionary housing payments or have been in receipt of local welfare support payments, which I think is really important. And we're really keen to start to understand, as I said, some of the impacts of these things over time, and also some of the correlations with other drivers. So looking at other broader data sets. We're doing a lot of work thinking about health data at the moment, education data. We're in that research stage at kind of looking at how this ties into other policy areas. But what's important here is that this is such a rich picture. So the changing shape of income, employment, and poverty correlates with almost every other social outcome you could be looking to sort of take an interest in. So understanding what works to tackle and support in this area can help you to identify what's working to tackle and support perhaps other outcomes that you're looking for across other parts of the local authority. Supporting people into work, improving health outcomes, improving educational outcomes, all of those sorts of areas. And one example of that might be, again, as we start to track longitudinally, one thing we've seen is that those that have been in work in the last 6 months tend to move back into work. So again, if you're trying to target employment support, you might want to, those are perhaps quicker wins. Whereas actually you might want to also focus that equally on those that are perhaps furthest away from the labour market too, in order to get the most bang for your buck. So that's just a couple of examples. And the place we're taking that, so we've shown you the Excel data. We're moving that toward one of the things we'd like to know, and again, do say if you think this is important. The reason we think this is important is because by turning it into an online dashboard, it's just starting to get local authorities, we're starting to get more and more local authorities that want to make this more of a part of business as usual. And in order for that to be the case, we need to start further automating the processing of this data to deliver the insights that you want and need and make those insights accessible. And we think this is potentially a powerful way of doing that. So this is, again, a live demo that I don't think we have time to show you today, but we will do in a future webinar as it develops, and I think we have done in a past webinar as well. And then the final point I wanted to make before we move on to questions is that, it's great to have this level of interest in this webinar. If there is more work we can do to support you, I think that would be great. And the knock-on positive impact of working with more and more local authorities is that we build up our picture of what's going on, and we're able to share that with you. And we very much see all of the relationships we have with each of our customers and clients, be they housing associations, local authorities, or employment service agencies, or even central government, as being a partnership. We want to learn from you and share some of what we learn from you with others, and hopefully you'll benefit from that as well. And start to begin to speak in one voice. I think there are two things that I think are really powerful drivers here. We all fundamentally want the same things. We want better outcomes for our residents, and we want them to become more independent, become less reliant upon the support services, because we don't have the same level of support services available as perhaps we had in the past. So we all want the same sort of outcomes. And another thing that I think is important is we all, by putting this data together, we can start to create a really clear picture of the truth. So, I've been in organisations where, different parts feel they deliver services better, and there are lots of arguments about or debates about who's best placed to deliver a particular service. And I think what is really powerful here is the data allows you to determine that with a little bit more clarity. It gives you a perspective to, I guess, challenge or frame that discussion and move forward constructively together as a partnership of organisations, all trying to work toward that same outcomes for residents. And we think that local role is critical. We work fundamentally with local organisations, and we think that their role in local welfare delivery is really, really important. And the case studies and the stories and the anecdotes that we get from working with those households are really, really important. And hopefully the data that we're able to provide, or the analysis we're able to provide, helps them to make better decisions around how to target that support. And we really think that's an exciting place for us to be. Those of you that want to join us on that journey, do please put your hand up and let Janet know, and we'll be in touch. I think this is a good place to pause for questions.
Yes.
You said there are others.
Yes, there's loads of really, really good questions. So I'm going to canter through, and forgive me if I haven't asked the question that you have posted, but we will definitely get back to you offline if we don't do it now. So starting off then, I suppose with a point, really, rather than a question as such, but one attendee says, individual household information would be really useful for supporting troubled families programs, allowing them to identify families who potentially meet criteria to enter the program and receive a range of support to improve their situation. So Devin, I know you talked about other data sets and other examples, but in particular, supporting troubled families programs was mentioned.
Can I come in there? So two thoughts off the cuff. One was that, so to say that we have worked with troubled families data before. We've sort of been able to integrate that once or twice, working closely with the local authority, because it came from a different data set, so there was some matching that was required. But the other thing that I think that's important is working with troubled families today. You have your cohort of troubled families that you're working with. I think a really powerful part of this analysis that perhaps I didn't emphasize in the data set is that we can model how people are affected today and how they'll be affected in the future. And therefore, you can start to determine between those households that have perhaps dealt with reforms reasonably well so far, and will continue to, because perhaps the mitigation from the impact of the national living wage is helping them to overcome perhaps what might be a short-term shock with universal credit or the benefit cap, versus those households that perhaps have coped reasonably well with reforms to date, but are unlikely or are going to struggle more to do so in the future. So you can start to hopefully not just help troubled families, but help stop families from being troubled in the first place. And I think that's a far more cost-effective way of supporting people. And I think that's another, again, something I'm quite passionate about helping local authorities and local organisations to do.
Okay. Another question, Devon. Do you consider the existing indices of deprivation scores from 2015 in your analysis, as this may cover what you are mentioning around postcode level analysis?
So I think the indices of multiple deprivation, we've been doing some work on, I've been doing some work with a group called the Social Metrics Commission that you'll be hearing about perhaps a little bit more in due course as their impact grows. the index of multiple deprivation is very useful, and it helps you to target support again at that neighbourhood level generally. And I think it's kind of, it'd be foolish for me to suggest that you need this data to identify, perhaps to a certain extent, where your general hotspots are, which neighbourhoods which parts of your local area, local borough you want to focus your attention on. I think most people on this call would probably recognise they know that. I think a big difference here is understanding which individual households within that local area perhaps need the most support. So the index of multiple deprivation doesn't fundamentally allow you to do that. So it goes down to those super output area levels that we heard about earlier, but it doesn't allow you to target support to individual households. And I think that's one reason why I think this is a bit more of a data revolution. There was one really, do I have time to break into a short anecdote?
Very quickly.
Okay, so there was another organisation that looks at data, was doing this mapping at that level, that sort of super output area level, and what they found was a really high level of deprivation in what they felt was a very affluent area. It's a very bizarre sort of thing to find, and they were curious, so they just went there. I think it was a London borough, and within this affluent area there was a large sort of social housing tower block, and it was just quite clear how, it was through the data that they were able to identify that, that was particularly the hotspot, which perhaps, again, when you think about it, that's an affluent area, we don't need to target support there, would have been the initial conclusion. They were able to just, again, using that data, say, well, actually, yes, there is a kind of a group or a household here that we need to support. Now, that's fair enough when it's perhaps just a tower block, but understanding which households within that tower block or which houses within that neighbourhood need that support, I think this level of analysis is really important too.
Okay, 2 questions here on the data set. How often will the data sets be updated? And secondly, does the data set show household level incomes?
Okay, so we offer, on the first question, we offer 2 versions of the analysis, 2 approaches to it. The first is a snapshot, which again, when we started out, that was the first piece that we were able to do. Now we've moved that forward onto perhaps the second service, which is to provide that initial snapshot, and along with that snapshot you get a reasonably detailed report about the impacts of welfare reform in your local area. So then providing that data, that analysis on an ongoing basis. Most of the local authorities we speak with are comfortable with receiving that on a quarterly basis, partly because they don't necessarily have the resources to deal with that on a monthly basis. I think that's an important driver. So currently we offer that on a quarterly basis. I think we'll be moving toward monthly at some point in the future. What was the second question, Janet?
The second question was around household level incomes. Does the data set show household level incomes?
Yes, so what we're able to do is, this is part of the cleaning up that Joel mentioned earlier. When we take that data, we redact all the personally identifiable information, and typically what those data sets show are individuals, and it's through our modelling process that we're able to combine all of that individual data, that includes data about income, into that picture of that household, which is what you need to do to be able to do this level of modelling. You need to understand the household level picture.
Okay, I think we've got time just to squeeze one last question in. There's a question regarding the better stroke worse off information for universal credit. Does that take into consideration the removal of the work allowance that came into place from April, and also the increased living wage?
Yes, so we model it at 3 different points in time. So we model it under the current system today. We model circumstances under universal credit if it were rolled out today, and also into the future. So we can model those circumstances through to 2020. The modeling software, which we haven't shown you on this webinar, but if you are interested in software that helps advisors to understand or explain the impacts of all these changes to residents, that's fundamentally the heart of this process. We keep that up to date, so as policies change, as the work allowances cuts were announced and then moved into legislation, we're able to show, we take those into account in our modelling analysis. And then the 2020 data also takes into account the increases in the national living wage all the way up to £9, currently at £7.20. So yes, would be a shorter answer.
Excellent. Okay. I'm going to finish up the questions. There are more, but as I say, we will get back to people individually with the specific answers if we haven't already answered you today. Do you want me to talk now, Devin? Mention this in terms of next steps? Excellent. Okay, so as I mentioned at the outset, thank you very much, everybody, for staying with us. We've nearly up on the hour now. When the webinar closes, there will be an automatic survey that asks you to give some feedback and also asks you what parts of the presentation, if any, you'd like extra information on. So please just take a quick moment just to do that. We'd be very grateful. You can also request a summary client report of the actual information. So we've talked in great depth about the data sets here. In addition, we give a report, a written report that highlights what we think are some of the areas to focus on for your particular council or your particular area. So we don't just give you the data sets, we do give you the report, and what I can offer you here is just a summary of that, what a client report might look like, so that you can have information, for example, to do presentations to Cabinet. Also, please do, if you would like to have a specific dataset demonstration one-on-one. Devin did a very quick canter through one here, but we can spend more time and go through one with you in more detail, and indeed also pricing details as well. So do take that opportunity. And as I said, on the slide here, we do have permission from some of our existing clients to share their specific reports with other local authorities who may be similar in structure, demographics or strategic vision to your council or your area. So do ask if you would like to see a real client report as opposed to a white label summary report. So that's all coming up immediately after the webinar, and it just leaves me to put this slide up here with Devon's contact details, and also our generic email address is hello@policyandpractice.co.uk. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Devon, I shall hand back to you for a last word before we close.
Well, I'd just like to second that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you very much for particularly your participation. A great number of questions, a great level of interest. I think a final thank you to Janet for helping to pull these slides together and hosting the webinar so well, and in particular to Joel for doing all of the analysis, having been with us for about 3 months and very sadly leaving us reasonably soon to go off and study and move on to do his master's. So, we really appreciate all the work that you've done for us in the time that you've been here, Joel. And if you look at some of the impact that work has had, you can sort of see some of that hopefully through the interest that people have taken in the content of the analysis that we've presented here today. So huge thank you to Joel.
Cool. Thanks, Devin.
And brilliant. Okay, back to you, Janet.
Okay, thanks everybody. Thanks everybody for your time. Take care. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.